The old piano sat in the corner of the community center, its wood scratched and faded from years of use. Nobody paid much attention to it anymore. Most people walked right past it without a second glance. But for Daniel, that piano was something special. It was the only place where he could forget about everything else and just play. Daniel was 23 years old, and life hadn't exactly gone the way he'd planned. Just 5 years ago, he was studying at one of the best music schools in the country. His teachers said he had real talent, the kind that doesn't come around very often. They talked about concert halls and recordings and a future that sparkled with possibility. But then his father got sick, and everything changed overnight. Medical bills piled up fast. His mother tried to keep the family afloat, but it wasn't enough. His younger sister was still in high school, dreaming of becoming a doctor someday. Someone had to step up. Someone had to make the hard choices. Daniel left the music school in his second year, packed his bags, and came home to help. Now he worked 2 jobs. During the day, he stocked shelves at a grocery store. At night, he waited tables at a diner downtown. The tips were decent on good nights, but nothing was ever quite enough. Still, he never complained. His sister was in college now, studying pre-med, and that made everything worth it. His father's health had improved, too. Some sacrifices, Daniel told himself, were just part of being a family. The community center was where Daniel volunteered on Saturday mornings. He helped set up for events, move chairs around, fix things that broke. In return, they let him use the piano whenever he wanted. It wasn't much, but it was something. That old upright piano became his escape, his reminder of who he used to be. On this particular Saturday evening, the center was buzzing with activity. They were hosting a fundraiser for the local children's hospital. People rushed around, hanging decorations, setting up tables, arranging flowers. The smell of catering food drifted through the air. Daniel had come early to help with the setup, and as usual, he found himself at the piano during a quiet moment. His fingers moved across the keys, playing simple scales and exercises. Nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. He kept the volume low, not wanting to disturb anyone. The piano needed tuning badly, and some of the keys stuck a little, but Daniel had learned to work around its quirks. In his mind, he wasn't in a dusty community center anymore. He was back in the practice rooms at school, preparing for his next recital, living the life he'd left behind. The door swung open with a loud bang. A group of people walked in, their voices carrying across the room. At the center of the group was Richard Donovan, a man everyone in town knew. He owned 3 car dealerships, a restaurant, and half the commercial real estate downtown. His face appeared on billboards all over the city. He wore an expensive suit and a watch that probably cost more than Daniel made in 6 months. Richard liked to think of himself as a patron of the arts. His house had a music room with a grand piano that cost $60,000. He attended symphony performances and opera nights, always sitting in the best seats. He collected rare instruments the way other people collected stamps. But according to people who actually knew music, Richard couldn't play much more than a basic melody. He just liked being seen as cultured and sophisticated. Tonight, Richard was the main sponsor of the fundraiser. He'd donated a significant amount of money, and he made sure everyone knew it. His entourage followed him around, laughing at his jokes and nodding at everything he said. They made their way through the center, Richard pointing at things and making comments about how the event should be arranged. Then he noticed Daniel at the piano. He stopped mid-sentence and tilted his head, listening. Daniel was still playing his scales, completely unaware he had an audience. Richard's expression changed. A smirk spread across his face. He walked over slowly, his expensive shoes clicking on the floor. His friends followed, sensing that something entertaining was about to happen. Daniel finished the scale he was playing and looked up, finding himself face to face with Richard Donovan and 5 other people staring at him. Well, Richard said, his voice loud enough for others nearby to hear. What do we have here? Daniel stood up politely. Good evening, sir. I was just helping with the setup. I hope the piano wasn't bothering anyone. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Oh no, not bothering, just interesting. He turned to his friends with that same smirk. Did you hear that? That's what passes for piano playing these days, apparently. A few of his companions chuckled, though some looked uncomfortable. Daniel felt his face grow warm. He'd dealt with people like this before. The kind who had money but no understanding. The kind who thought buying expensive things made them experts. You call that playing? Richard continued, his voice dripping with amusement. He laughed, and it wasn't a kind laugh. My 10-year-old nephew takes lessons, and honestly, he's got better technique than what I just heard. No offense, of course. The words stung more than Daniel wanted to admit. Not because Richard's opinion mattered, but because it touched something deep and painful. Here was someone who probably couldn't play a simple song, mocking years of dedication and sacrifice. Here was someone who'd never had to give up his dreams, laughing at someone who had. Daniel started gathering his sheet music from the piano. I apologize if it wasn't up to standard, he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. I should get back to helping with the chairs. Mrs. Patterson, the center's director, had been watching from across the room. She was a kind woman in her 60s who'd run the community center for over 20 years. She knew Daniel's story. She'd heard him play late at night when he thought no one was around. She'd seen the sadness in his eyes when he looked at that old piano, and she understood it came from a place of lost dreams. She walked over quickly. Richard, good to see you, she said, her tone professional but firm. I hope everything meets your expectations for tonight. Richard barely glanced at her. He was still focused on Daniel, that smirk still on his face. Oh, everything's wonderful, Patricia. Just stumbled upon some amateur hour entertainment here. He gestured at Daniel like he was some kind of curiosity. Other people had started to notice the commotion. Event staff paused in their work. Early arrivals for the fundraiser turned to look. Daniel felt dozens of eyes on him, and he wanted nothing more than to disappear. But something was building inside him, something he'd pushed down for 5 long years. It started as a small flame in his chest and grew warmer with each passing second. He thought about all those nights at the diner, his feet aching and his back sore. He thought about his sister, working hard to become a doctor. He thought about his father, getting healthier every day. He thought about the dreams he'd sacrificed, and the music that still lived inside him, buried but not dead. Daniel looked at Richard Donovan, really looked at him. He saw a man who had everything but understood nothing. A man who bought culture but never earned it. A man who thought money could replace dedication, and that mocking others made him superior. And in that moment, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. Richard turned to the small crowd that had gathered around them. He seemed to be enjoying the attention, feeding off it like fuel. His voice got louder, more theatrical. He was putting on a show now, and Daniel was the unwilling star of it. You know what? Richard announced, spreading his arms wide like he was addressing a whole auditorium. I've got an idea. Let's make this evening more interesting. He paused for effect, making sure everyone was listening. I'm a generous man, as most of you know. So here's what I'm going to do. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was thick with cash and credit cards, the kind of wallet that screamed money. He made a big show of opening it, letting everyone see the $100 bills inside. I'll put up $1,000, Richard said, his voice ringing through the community center. $1,000 cash to anyone here tonight who can actually play the piano. And I mean really play it. Not that beginner stuff we just heard. I'm talking about real music. The kind that moves people, the kind that makes you feel something. His friends laughed and nodded. A few people in the growing crowd whispered to each other. $1,000 was serious money. For most people, there it represented rent for a month or groceries for a family or a car payment. It wasn't the kind of money you just threw around. Daniel stood there, his sheet music clutched in his hands. He felt frozen, caught between walking away and staying put. Part of him wanted to leave with whatever dignity he had left. But another, part of him, a part he'd been ignoring for 5 years, was waking up. That part remembered what it felt like to sit at a real piano and make magic happen. That part remembered the standing ovations and the praise from his professors. That part remembered who he used to be before life got in the way. Mrs. Patterson caught his eye again. She gave him a small nod, so subtle that nobody else would have noticed. But Daniel saw it. She believed in him. She'd heard him play when he thought nobody was listening, late at night after his shift at the diner, when the center was empty, and he could finally let himself feel again. The crowd had grown larger now. At least 30 people had gathered around the piano area. Some were event staff, some were early guests for the fundraiser. They all waited to see what would happen next. The air felt electric with anticipation. Daniel set his sheet music down on top of the piano. His hands were shaking slightly, but not from nervousness. It was something else. Adrenaline, maybe, or anger, or 5 years of bottled-up frustration finally finding a way out. "I'll accept your challenge," Daniel said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. The room got even quieter. People leaned in to hear better. Richard's eyebrows shot up. He clearly hadn't expected this. The smile on his face got wider, more mocking. "Oh, really? You're serious?" He turned to his friends, pointing at Daniel like he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. "This should be good. This should be very entertaining." He walked over to a chair in the front row and sat down with exaggerated comfort. He crossed his legs and folded his arms across his chest. His whole body language screamed skepticism and amusement. His friends found seats nearby, whispering to each other and smirking. "Please," Richard said, gesturing toward the piano bench like a king granting an audience. "The stage is yours. Let's see what you've got. Show us this real talent you're hiding." Daniel walked to the piano bench and sat down. The worn cushion felt familiar under him. He'd sat here hundreds of times over the past few years, but this time was different. This time people were watching. This time something was on the line. Not just the money, though he'd be lying if he said that didn't matter. But something bigger, something about dignity and respect and proving that wealth didn't equal worth. His mind raced through every piece he'd ever learned. He had dozens to choose from. Hundreds, really. Years of training had filled his head with music. But what should he play? Something showy and technical to prove his skill? Something emotional and moving to touch people's hearts? Something famous that everyone would recognize? He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The noise of the room faded away. The whispers, Richard's smug expression, the pressure of the moment. All of it dimmed. In that silence, he found his answer. He knew exactly what to play. It was a piece he'd performed at his last recital before leaving music school. A piece that had taken him months to learn, that had pushed him to his absolute limits. A piece that was technically brutal and emotionally exhausting. His professor had chosen it specifically for him, said it matched his spirit perfectly. It was the kind of piece that separated amateurs from artists. Daniel opened his eyes and positioned his hands over the keys. The piano was old and out of tune, but that didn't matter anymore. A real musician could make music on anything. He'd learned that over the years, playing on this beat-up upright while remembering the beautiful grand pianos at school. The first notes came out soft and gentle. They floated through the air like whispers, delicate and careful. It was a slow beginning, deceptively simple. Just a melody, pure and clean. Some people in the crowd shifted, wondering if this was going to be boring. Richard still wore that smirk, though it looked a bit more uncertain now. But Daniel was just getting started. The melody repeated, this time with his left hand adding harmony underneath. The music began to build. His fingers moved with practiced precision, each note exactly where it needed to be. The tempo increased slightly, then more. The simple melody from the beginning transformed into something more complex, more urgent. His body started to move with the music. Not in a showy way, but naturally, the way musicians do when they stop thinking and start feeling. His shoulders swayed. His head tilted slightly. He was going somewhere else now, somewhere beyond the community center, beyond Richard's challenge, beyond everything. The crowd's energy changed. You could feel it in the air. People stopped whispering. They stopped shifting in their seats. They just listened. Even Richard's smirk was fading, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. The piece built higher and higher. Daniel's hands flew across the keyboard, hitting complex runs and difficult passages that would make most people's fingers cramp. But for him it was like breathing, like speaking his native language after years of silence. His right hand danced in the upper register while his left hand thundered in the bass. The contrast was stunning. Mrs. Patterson felt tears forming in her eyes. She'd suspected Daniel was good, but this was something else entirely. This was the kind of playing you heard on recordings, in concert halls, from people who dedicated their lives to their craft. A few other people in the crowd were getting emotional too. There was something about the music, the way Daniel played it, that reached inside and grabbed hold. It wasn't just notes and rhythm. It was story and feeling and pain and joy all mixed together. The piece moved into a quieter section. Daniel's touch became gentle again, almost fragile. The melody that had been so powerful just moments before now sounded vulnerable and lonely. It was like hearing someone's heart breaking in musical form, and then, just when it seemed like the sadness might overwhelm everything, the music shifted. Hope crept in. Strength returned. The volume grew again. Richard sat frozen in his chair. His arms were no longer crossed. His face had gone pale. Whatever he'd expected to hear, it wasn't this. This was professional-level playing. This was conservatory training. This was years of dedication and natural talent combined into something remarkable. Daniel's hands crashed down on the keys with powerful chords. The climax was approaching. The music exploded through the room like a storm breaking loose. Daniel's fingers hammered out thundering octaves that made the old piano shake. The force of it was almost physical. You could feel it in your chest, in your bones. This wasn't just sound anymore. It was raw emotion turned into music, and it was impossible to ignore. People who had been setting up tables in other parts of the community center stopped what they were doing. They walked toward the piano area, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. The catering staff paused mid-task, trays in their hands, listening. Within minutes, almost everyone in the building had gathered around. Daniel's hands moved so fast they were almost a blur. He executed passages that looked impossible, fingers crossing over each other, stretching across the keyboard, hitting notes with perfect accuracy even at that incredible speed. But it wasn't just about being fast. Every note had purpose. Every phrase had meaning. The technical difficulty was mind-blowing, but the emotion behind it was what really hit you. The piece told a story without words. You could hear struggle in those crashing chords. You could hear determination in the rapid runs up and down the keyboard. You could hear pain and loss and the refusal to give up. It was like Daniel was pouring 5 years of his life into this performance. Every sacrifice he'd made, every dream he'd buried, every late-night shift at the diner when his body ached and his soul felt empty. All of it was coming out through his hands. Richard sat completely still now. His face had gone from pale to almost gray. The smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked like shock. Maybe even shame, though it was hard to tell. His friends beside him had stopped whispering. They just stared at Daniel, their mouths slightly open. One woman in the crowd had tears streaming down her face. She didn't bother wiping them away. A man in a business suit stood with his arms crossed, but his eyes were closed, just taking in the music. Mrs. Patterson had given up trying to hold back her emotions. She stood there openly crying, her hand over her heart. The piece shifted again. After all that power and fury, Daniel brought it down to almost nothing. His touch became impossibly soft. The notes barely whispered out of the piano. It was like after a massive storm, when everything goes quiet and still. The contrast was devastating. Some people in the crowd actually gasped. Daniel played a melody so gentle and pure it hurt to hear. It was the same melody from the beginning, but now it carried all the weight of everything that had come before. It sounded like a memory of something beautiful that had been lost, like looking at an old photograph and remembering how things used to be. His body swayed gently now. His eyes were closed. Sweat had formed on his forehead from the physical exertion of the piece. His breathing was deep and controlled. He was completely lost in the music, in a world that only he could see. For these precious minutes, Daniel wasn't in a dusty community center playing a beat-up piano. He was back where he belonged. He was who he was meant to be. The quiet section built slowly. Small additions here and there. A little more volume. A little more intensity. The left hand started adding more beneath the right. The tempo picked up gradually. You could feel something building, like pressure mounting before an explosion. The entire room held its breath. Then Daniel unleashed the final section. His hands attacked the keyboard with controlled violence. Massive chords rang out, each one perfectly voiced so every note sang through clearly. Fast passages ripped up and down in patterns that seemed physically impossible. The old piano, despite its age and condition, responded to his touch like it had been waiting years for someone who really knew how to play it. The music climbed higher and higher. Each phrase built on the last one. The intensity kept growing until it felt like the room couldn't contain it anymore. Some people actually stepped back, overwhelmed by the sheer force of what they were hearing. This was music that demanded everything from the performer and gave everything to the listener. And then, just when it seemed like the piece might explode into chaos, Daniel pulled it back. The final phrases became clearer, more focused. All that power and complexity resolved into something achingly beautiful. The music that had been so wild and angry transformed into something peaceful, not happy exactly. More like acceptance, like someone who'd been through hell and come out the other side stronger. The last chord rang out clear and strong. Daniel held it, letting it resonate through the room. He kept his hands on the keys, his foot on the pedal, letting every last bit of vibration sing out until it faded naturally into silence. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. The silence after that performance was almost as powerful as the music itself. It was like the whole room needed a second to recover, to process what they'd just experienced. Daniel slowly lifted his hands from the keys. He opened his eyes and blinked, like someone waking up from a deep dream. He looked down at his hands, almost surprised to see them there. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. His shirt was damp with sweat. He felt completely drained and completely alive at the same time. Then the spell broke. Someone started clapping, then another person, then everyone at once. The applause erupted like thunder. People weren't just clapping politely. They were clapping hard with real enthusiasm. Several people jumped to their feet. Then more followed. Within seconds, the entire crowd was standing, applauding wildly. Some people were still crying. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. A few were hugging each other like they'd just witnessed something historic. The catering staff, still holding their trays, put them down just so they could clap properly. Even the teenagers who'd been on their phones earlier were standing and applauding, their devices forgotten. Mrs. Patterson pushed through the crowd, tears still streaming down her face. She reached Daniel and pulled him into a tight hug. She couldn't speak. She just held him, and Daniel could feel her shaking with emotion. When she finally let go, she looked at him with such pride and joy that Daniel felt his own eyes getting wet. "Where did you learn to play like that?" someone shouted from the crowd. "Why aren't you performing professionally?" another person called out. "Have you recorded anything? Do you teach?" The questions came rapid fire from different people, everyone wanting to know more about this mysterious pianist who'd just blown their minds. Daniel tried to answer, but his voice came out rough. His throat was tight with emotion. He'd forgotten what this felt like. The connection with an audience. The way music could make a room full of strangers feel like family. The pure joy of performing at his absolute best. He'd buried all of this so deep, convinced he'd never feel it again. More people crowded around, offering congratulations, asking questions, telling him how much the performance had moved them. An older gentleman in an expensive suit pushed forward. "Young man, I'm on the board of the symphony. We need to talk." A woman with kind eyes said, "My daughter takes piano lessons. Would you consider teaching?" Through all the chaos and excitement, Daniel looked over at Richard. The businessman was still in his seat, but he'd stood up. His face was a complicated mix of emotions. Shock, definitely. Embarrassment, clearly. But there was something else there, too. Something that might have been respect or maybe humility. Whatever confidence and arrogance he'd walked in with had been stripped away by 7 minutes of incredible music. Richard walked forward slowly. The crowd parted to let him through. Richard stood in front of Daniel, and for the first time all evening he looked small. Not physically, of course. He was still wearing his expensive suit and his luxury watch. But something had changed. The armor of arrogance he'd been wearing had cracked wide open. Richard started, then stopped. His voice came out rough, uncertain. This was clearly a man who wasn't used to being wrong, who didn't often find himself in situations where he had to apologize. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I need to say something." The crowd quieted down, sensing that this moment was important. Daniel stood there, still catching his breath, waiting to hear what Richard would say. Part of him expected more mockery, more dismissal. That's what his experience had taught him. People with money and power rarely admitted when they were wrong. That was Richard paused, searching for words. I've attended concerts at some of the finest venues in the world. I've heard pianists whose tickets cost hundreds of dollars. I've sat in opera houses and symphony halls in 3 different countries. He shook his head slowly. And what you just did, right here on this old piano, moved me more than any of those performances. The admission seemed to cost him something. His friends stood nearby, looking uncomfortable. They'd been laughing along with his jokes earlier, feeding his ego. Now they didn't know where to look. I owe you an apology, Richard continued. A real one. What I said earlier, the way I mocked you, it was wrong. Completely wrong. I judged you based on nothing. On assumptions and arrogance. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. His hands were actually shaking a little as he opened it. The $1,000 is yours, he said, starting to write. Though honestly, after what you just played, it seems like an insult to offer so little. Daniel watched him write the check. $1,000. That was 2 weeks of work at the grocery store. A month of shifts at the diner. It was his sister's textbooks for next semester. It was a small cushion against the constant financial pressure that had defined his life for 5 years. But as Richard held out the check, Daniel realized something. The money mattered, yes, but something else had happened here tonight that mattered more. For 7 minutes he'd been himself again. Completely, fully himself. Not the grocery store clerk or the waiter or the guy who'd given up his dreams. He'd been Daniel the pianist. Daniel the musician. Daniel the artist. He took the check with a quiet, "Thank you." Richard nodded, but he didn't walk away. He stood there like he wanted to say more, like the apology and the money weren't quite enough to settle whatever debt he felt he owed. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said. "Where did you train? How does someone with your talent end up?" He gestured vaguely around the community center, not finishing the sentence. Daniel hesitated. He didn't usually talk about this. The wound was still too fresh, even after 5 years. But something about tonight, about the performance, about everything that had happened, made him want to answer honestly. "I was at the Riverside Conservatory," Daniel said. "2nd year. Full scholarship. My professor said I had a real shot at a professional career." He paused, the old pain surfacing. "Then my father got sick. Cancer. The medical bills were crushing my family. My mom was working double shifts just to keep up with the mortgage. My sister was still in high school talking about becoming a doctor someday. The crowd had gone quiet again, listening. This wasn't the story they'd expected. Someone had to step up, Daniel continued. Someone had to make sure the bills got paid and my sister could go to college and my dad could get the treatment he needed. So I left school and came home. Got a job. Then another job. That was 5 years ago." He looked down at the check in his hands. "The piano here at the community center is the only one I have access to now. Mrs. Patterson lets me play whenever I want in exchange for helping around the place. It's not much, but it's something." Richard's face had gone even more pale. "You gave up a conservatory scholarship? A professional career?" He sounded genuinely shocked. "For your family?" "Of course," Daniel said simply. "What else was I supposed to do? They needed me." Several people in the crowd were crying again, but for different reasons now. This wasn't just a story about hidden talent. It was a story about sacrifice and family and the things people give up for love. Richard stood there processing this information. You could see the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he spoke again. "What's your father's condition now?" "Better," Daniel said, and a real smile crossed his face for the first time. "He's been in remission for 2 years. The doctors say his prognosis is good. And your sister?" "Junior year at State University, pre-med. She's got a 3.9 GPA. She's going to be an amazing doctor." Richard nodded slowly. He pulled out his phone and started typing something. His friends watched him, confused. The crowd waited, not sure what was happening. "I need to make this right," Richard said, more to himself than anyone else. "I've spent years collecting instruments I barely play, attending concerts I don't really appreciate, pretending to understand music because I thought it made me look cultured." He looked up from his phone directly at Daniel. "But you actually understand it. You live it, and I nearly dismissed you like you were nothing." He finished typing and put his phone away. "I have connections. People on conservatory boards, scholarship committees, concert hall directors. People who actually understand what real talent looks like, unlike me apparently." He gave a self-deprecating laugh. "Let me make some calls. No promises, but I think I can help get you back on track." Daniel stared at him. I appreciate that, but I still have responsibilities. My sister's tuition, helping my parents. Interrupted. What if there was a scholarship that covered not just your education, but provided a living stipend? What if your family wasn't sacrificing your dreams anymore? The older gentleman who'd mentioned the symphony board stepped forward. Richard's right to help, but I want in on this too. Young man, what you played tonight was extraordinary. The symphony runs a scholarship program for exceptional talent. I'll personally sponsor your application. The woman who'd asked about teaching spoke up. And I run a music school. We're always looking for talented instructors. If you taught just 1 day a week, the pay would be competitive and the hours flexible. More people started offering help. Someone knew a dean at another music school. Another person offered to spread the word about Daniel's talent on social media. A music journalist in the crowd said she wanted to write a feature article. It was overwhelming. Mrs. Patterson stood beside Daniel, her hand on his shoulder. She was beaming with pride but also looked concerned. Daniel, she said quietly, you don't have to decide anything right now. This is all very sudden. She was right. Just an hour ago, Daniel had been setting up chairs for a fundraiser. Now his entire life seemed to be shifting under his feet. The check in his hand felt heavy, not because of the money, but because of what it represented. A door opening, a possibility he'd thought was closed forever. Richard pulled out a business card and handed it to Daniel. Call me tomorrow, or the next day, whenever you're ready. We'll figure this out together, and I mean that. I want to help make this happen. Daniel took the card, still trying to process everything. Around him, people were still talking, still offering congratulations and support. The fundraiser that was supposed to be the main event of the evening had become secondary to this unexpected moment. Daniel didn't call Richard the next day, or the day after that. The business card sat on his dresser for almost a week, and every time he looked at it, a war started in his head. Hope fought with fear. Dreams battled with responsibility. What if this was real? What if it wasn't? What if he let himself believe again and everything fell apart? He went to work at the grocery store, stocking shelves and ringing up customers. He served tables at the diner, forcing smiles when his feet ached. But something had changed inside him. That performance at the community center had opened something up, and now he couldn't close it again. The music was louder in his head. His fingers itched to play. Every spare moment he found himself back at that old piano. Mrs. Patterson noticed. You're playing differently, she said one afternoon, bringing him a cup of coffee while he practiced. More alive somehow. Daniel's sister noticed too when she came home for the weekend. She walked into the community center and heard him playing from outside. She stood in the doorway just listening with tears in her eyes. When he finished, she came over and hugged him tight. I miss this, she said quietly. I miss hearing you play like this. I miss seeing you happy. I am happy, Daniel protested. You're in school, Dad's healthy, everything's working out. She pulled back and looked at him hard. Don't lie to yourself. You've been surviving, not living. There's a difference. She picked up Richard's business card from where it sat on top of the piano. You need to call this guy. It's complicated, Daniel said. Life is complicated, his sister shot back. But that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice everything forever. You gave up 5 years for us. Let us give something back to you. That night, the whole family sat around the dinner table. Daniel's father looked stronger than he had in years. His mother seemed less tired, less stressed. The medical bills were manageable now. They'd made it through the worst. Tell them, his sister said. And she explained about the performance, about Richard's offer, about all the people who'd wanted to help. Daniel's mother started crying before his sister even finished. But they were happy tears. Oh, honey, she said, reaching across to grab Daniel's hand. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Because I didn't want you to feel bad, Daniel admitted. I made my choice 5 years ago. I'd make it again. His father cleared his throat. He was a quiet man, always had been, but when he spoke, people listened. Son, you saved this family. You put your life on hold to keep us afloat, but if you don't pick that life back up now, then what was it all for? You think I want to spend the rest of my days knowing my boy gave up his dreams because of me? Dad, call him, his father said firmly. Call that man tomorrow. See what he can do. And if it works out, you take it. You take it and you run with it and you don't look back. That's what we want, all of us. So the next morning, Daniel called. Richard picked up on the second ring like he'd been waiting. They met at a coffee shop that afternoon. Richard brought a folder full of papers, information about scholarships, music programs, opportunities. He'd been busy. The Riverside Conservatory has a re-entry program, Richard explained, spreading papers across the table, for students who had to leave for legitimate reasons. Financial hardship definitely qualifies. I spoke with the dean. She remembers you. She said you were one of the most talented students they'd had in years. Daniel's heart was pounding. And the cost? There's a scholarship that covers full tuition plus a living stipend. It's funded by a private donor. Richard paused. The donor is anonymous, but he's very interested in supporting your return to school. Daniel looked at him. You're the donor. Richard shrugged, but he was smiling. I've got more money than I know what to do with. Might as well use it for something meaningful. He pulled out another paper. The symphony also wants you to give a recital. 6 months from now. It'll be a proper debut performance. Press promotion, the whole thing, 6 months. Daniel's mind reeled. Half a year to prepare, to get back in shape, to remember what it felt like to be a real musician again. Over the next few weeks, things moved fast. Daniel applied for the re-entry program and got accepted within days. The scholarship came through. He cut his hours at both jobs, just enough to keep some income but leave time for practice. His sister helped him put together an audition recording to send to the symphony selection committee. The hardest part was telling his managers he'd be leaving eventually. The grocery store manager, a kind woman named Helen who'd given him a chance 5 years ago, actually hugged him when he explained. I always knew you were too talented to be stocking shelves forever, she said. Go be who you're meant to be. 3 months later, Daniel moved back to the city where the conservatory was located. Richard had helped him find a small apartment near campus. It wasn't fancy, but it had enough space for an upright piano that Richard insisted on providing. You can't practice on campus pianos at 2 a.m., Richard had said. You need your own instrument. Being back at the conservatory felt like putting on old clothes that still fit perfectly. His technique had stayed sharp thanks to those long nights at the community center. His professors were amazed at how much he'd maintained over 5 years away. But more than that, they noticed something new in his playing. A depth and maturity that hadn't been there before. You've lived, his old professor said after hearing him play. You understand things now that you didn't before. The music has weight to it, meaning. That's what separates good players from great ones. The 6 months flew by. Practice sessions that stretched for hours. Master classes where he learned from visiting artists. Late-night jam sessions with other students who became fast friends. Daniel threw himself into music with an intensity he'd never managed before, because now he knew what it was like to lose it. His family came to visit once a month. His sister brought her textbooks and studied while he practiced. His parents walked around campus proud and amazed that their son was really doing this. Richard came by occasionally too, not to check up on Daniel, but because they'd become genuine friends. The arrogant businessman had been humbled by that night at the community center, and the experience had changed him. I'm setting up a foundation, Richard told Daniel over lunch one day. Scholarships for talented musicians who face financial hardship. You're going to be the first recipient officially, but there will be others. Lots of others. There's too much talent out there getting wasted because of money. Finally, the night of the recital arrived. The concert hall was beautiful, with perfect acoustics and rows of plush seats. Daniel stood backstage in formal concert attire, his hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from anticipation, from joy, from the sheer overwhelming gratitude of getting a second chance. The audience was packed. His family sat in the front row. Mrs. Patterson had driven 3 hours to be there. His co-workers from the diner and grocery store had bought tickets. Students from the conservatory filled entire sections. And there was Richard, sitting not in the best seat this time, but off to the side, content to just be present for the moment. The stage manager gave Daniel the signal. He walked out into the lights and the applause. He sat at the beautiful grand piano, infinitely better than that old upright at the community center. He adjusted the bench, took a breath, and positioned his hands over the keys, and then he played. Not for the $1,000 this time. Not to prove anything to anyone. He played because this was who he was. This was what he was meant to do. He played for Yves.